Few things will get a pastor in more hot water with their congregation than talking about money. And yet if we read the Bible, we see that Jesus talked about money all the time. In fact, he talked about money more than he talked about any other subject. Now, why is there such a disconnect between the life of a congregation and what we see from Jesus in the Scriptures? Well, I think there are a couple of reasons for that. First of all, as people who are disciples who are seeking to follow Christ, we often think about things in big concepts, and we think about things like grace and love. We start talking about money, and that gets a lot more personal, and sometimes, I think about my money as being mine and nobody else's business, certainly not my pastor's. I think there's another reason for it, though, too, and it comes down to God's sovereignty. Is God really the master of everything? There's an old prayer that was prayed by church leaders for a long time that said, "All things cometh from thee, we give thee but thine own." And I think that's a great prayer, but do we really believe that? In the ancient times, during the time that the Bible was written, it was mostly an agrarian society. So people, they raised their own crops and they raised their own livestock. Sometimes there were certainly people who used their hands to create handicrafts or things that you would find useful in your home. But for the most part, when they thought about how they earned their living and the way that they lived, it came from things that were out of their control. Yes, you had to plant seeds and make sure that you watered the ground, but the way that the nutrients worked in the soil and the way that the sun nourished the plants, certainly for people in ancient times, they didn't understand all of those processes, and even if they did, we're not responsible for those, so that comes from God. The way we raise livestock, yes, you might breed animals and feed them and take care of them, but whether an animal's healthy or not is really, in large part, outside of our control. Even for people who made things like taking iron and making it into a tool or shaping wood into a chair or clay into a lamp, those things still relied on source materials that we couldn't create ourselves. So people had a real sense that everything in their life came from something greater than themselves. It came from God, and so everything that they had, in fact, was a gift from God. Now, the way that we began to think about that as God's people were shaped by Scripture and by practice, we understood that because those things didn't come from us, that they were actually belonged to God, that it was our responsibility to share those things back with God and with God's people. So what would happen is people would bring a certain percentage of what they had raised, their crops, for instance. They would bring fruits and vegetables and grains and place them in the temple, or they would bring an animal that would be used for meat for those who worked in the temple and the poor people around them. Even some of the crafts that they made, they might bring the items themselves, or more likely, whatever they earned in the market for those things, they would bring a percentage of that back to God because they knew that it came from God in the first place. We began to think of that as something called a tithe. And in the Bible, we talk about a tithe as being 10% of everything that you've raised, everything that you've earned. That's how that practice came about. There were other offerings that came as well, but that was always separate from the tithe, that there was an understanding that part of what we have comes from God and it belongs to God. So we bring it back. Now today, thankfully, we don't pay our staff in produce and livestock anymore. I think that's probably good for all of us. But we've gotten pretty far away from raising our own food and producing our own things, and so we forget that everything we have actually comes from God. I go down to the supermarket and I find fruits and vegetables displayed all beautifully there with maybe a little sticker that might tell me where it came from, but I never see the farm. The meat that I have is already carved and placed neatly under cellophane. I never see the animals or the work that goes into producing that. So I forget. I lose touch with that. We live in a society that's based mostly on exchange of services and goods now, and so we don't see the source of a lot of the things that are in our lives now. But the principle is still true. Everything at its source doesn't come from us, it comes from God. So it's our privilege to share that back. It's our responsibility to share a portion of what we have back with God. And we still talk about that as people of faith, as being part of what it means to be a disciple, to give a portion of what we have, a percentage of what we have earned, back to God and to God's service. Thinking about Jesus and how this relates to our discipleship, Jesus talked about, I said, money all the time. Jesus didn't talk about rules, though, and he didn't teach based on follow this rule and do this and do that. He mostly taught using stories. One particular story that Jesus taught is recorded by the gospel writers, and it's a little different depending on who's presenting it at which time, but the meaning is essentially the same. See, it seems there was a certain man who was preparing to go on a journey. And as he got ready to go, he took the things that were valuable to him. He took his wealth and he shared it with some of his servants and trusted it into their care until he would return. Well, there were 3 servants, and each one of them handled that responsibility a little differently. 2 of them took what he had entrusted to them, and they used it to earn something. They invested it, and they shared it with other people, and it brought back some return. The 3rd was a little afraid and thought maybe there might not be enough, or what would happen if that got used and it didn't come back. And he was afraid that maybe he would get in trouble if he used it inappropriately. Well, in time, the master did come back. That man came back and asked for an accounting. And the first 2 showed what they had earned from that work. They showed how they used the gifts given to them. And the man was pleased by that. The 3rd, though, came and he said, I was afraid, so I kept this hoarded for myself. I guarded it closely. And you know how the story ends, that this was not pleasing to that man. In fact, he took away what had been given to him. But to the ones who had earned something, the man gave more. Now, does that mean that we're always going to receive a blessing whenever we invest the resources we have wisely? No, that's not really how that works. We don't have a quid pro quo in our way of discipleship. But it does tell us something about the responsible use of resources. And I think perhaps what Jesus was asking us to do is to think about the gifts that we have and the way that we choose to use them. Do we see them primarily as being for us? Or do we see them primarily as things that are shared with us to be used for good? Those are questions that we have to wrestle with all the time, whether we're talking about the way we spend our time or the way we spend our money. And those are important questions. They're also really hard questions. But as we're thinking about what it means to be a disciple of Jesus Christ, we want to do the things that Jesus did and do the things that Jesus taught. If Jesus spent that much time talking about things like giving, maybe we should spend some more time thinking about those things too.